Hi, Sidra.
Hi, Akel. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good too. Good.
I'm super excited to hear about your project. Can you tell me a bit about it?
Sure, I will. So my project is called Representations of Childhood and Children in Hindi Cinema. So would you
Yeah,
like me to walk you through the project?
yeah, I'd love to. That's great. I wanted to know about what was your main motivation for the project?
Okay, so my main motivation comes from my previous training in history and film and television programming, and my current training in children's literature, media, and culture. So, when I started the project, I realized that there's little research in children's media in India, and from the perspective of what stories they tell, who and how they represent, and what ideologies they engender. So, I decided to work with films as my primary text because one, they're popular cultural and entertainment source across India, and second, because they tell stories and represent what the society feel or the understanding that people get, the audience and children get from those films. And I decided to narrow down my research for Hindi films as opposed to regional cinema because it's the largest language market in my country.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And what would you say are the key findings of your dissertation?
So, my key findings from the dissertation is that first and foremost, I realized that there's a shift in from Western children's media to non-Western children's media, which includes like focus on Asian countries, including India. So I come to India where I understand that the children's culture is in India is undergoing a revolution where they are representing children in childhood, and if you look it through an historical perspective, you come to understand that these representation are influenced by the changing national ideals and imperatives. So I'm going to analyze the Indian modern history, which I'll talk about how I've divided in later section. And the other two key findings is like I realized that there is an ideal Indian child which is attributed to a boy from a middle class family and from a religious Hindu religion. So this is a definition or a common theme across these films that I have found in my research also. And the most important part that I've realized is that the films about children become synonymously films for children in India. These are my key findings in the project.
Oh, that's great. And what about main theories? Do you have any specific authors that influenced your work?
Yeah. So let's come to my main analysis chapters, and they're divided in three eras, as I mentioned earlier, in the modern history, modern Indian history. So my first analysis chapter and my first era is around the post-independent India when India got independence in 1947 to 1970s. So in this chapter, I analyze the cinematic image of children in young nation through two different films. And I decided to take two films because India is such a vast and diverse country. So one film would not do a justice in the analysis. So I took Boot Polish and Jagrati and examined the portrayal of two contrasting childhood, one an orphan street child, another from upper middle class child. And in both the films, a common theme was like education was seen as an important tool for making the upright citizens. As India just gained independence, so for them, children were seen as a future and they had to make the upright citizens for the future. For this chapter, my work analysis is based on the work of Nandini Chandra's chapter, which talks about how the films in 1950s were nationalistic, child-centric films. And then I work with Shakuntala Banerjee's major work and use them to understand the class differences and how these class differences impact the kind of agencies children have coming from different economic classes and how they use these. So this was my first analysis chapter. Moving on to my second analysis chapter in the second era, which was India's political and economic crisis. In this, I focused on the female coming of age with two films, Guddi and Balikavadu. And I looked at how society viewed girl children and their development, shifting away from solely viewing young girls and women as objects of reform to recognizing their participation in playful activities. And for this chapter, I used Rubilal's work, and where she talks about how in the 19th century, the girl child and art of playfulness. Through that, she looks at the coming of age of females. Then my last chapter and the last analysis is about India's move from it's from 1990s till present, and India at this time adapted the liberalization, privatization, and globalization phase. So I look at two films, Tare Zameen Par and Uran, through which I highlight how there has been a transition of understanding a child as compared to the earlier two periods that I mentioned in my thesis. So the films here, they mark a change in the setting. Now they're mostly based in urban and global spaces, determined by the consumptions of children and young adults. And also their narratives are inflected by children and young adults' individual freedoms and aspirations, which kind of influence their relationships they share with their family, with their parents, and also the education institutions, schools, and the friends around them. And for this chapter, I was influenced and I used the work of Ritti Elukos and Jitsana Kapoor because they talk about how liberalization and globalization impacted and changed the relationship of children, childhood in India with the opening of economy and everything. So these are my three main analysis chapters.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I was thinking, who would you think would benefit from it? Because I certainly would. I don't know anything about Indian cinema, so.
So as I mentioned in the beginning, like because childhood studies is gaining ground in India, so I feel like for them this will be a very influential study to understand how childhood and children have been represented over the course of time, because it's looking at like 70, 80 years of representation through films. So for them, and then because it's film, so it will be very helpful for cultural and media studies scholars to look at, because I just don't talk about political history of India, political and economic, but also the cinematic and what kind of cinema movements internationally and nationally were influencing these films and how the directors and everybody was taking up these moments. So, which brings me to my last group of people, which is the filmmakers. That for them it will be also helpful because India is producing thousands of films every year, but only 0.1% film is for children. So we need to start working in making more films for children, and also try to involve children to be the participant and like equal participants in making and producing those films.
Oh, I love that. Our time is almost done, but I have one more question. What was the most exciting thing about your thesis?
Okay, so the two most exciting elements from the thesis was like I realized because earlier I was a bit scared that whether I will be able to find more academic work on India, but I've realized like in the past decade, childhood studies have gained so much ground among Indian scholars, and so much is happening in children's literature, in children's media in India, and a lot of diversification and representation of different communities, religion, caste, and everything is coming up. And also the democratization of technology, I feel, is an important player, because now people don't need to have expensive cameras. They have smartphones, which are easy access. So independent filmmakers who are working with children or even academic scholars, they have started collaborating with children and providing them with devices so they can record or make films or record journalistic videos and present them through child's perspective as well as through their gaze. So these two were the very exciting elements that I come across from my thesis.
That was lovely, and I can't wait to read your thesis. So, but our time is done, but thank you so much for the interview. I loved it.
Welcome. Bye.
Bye, Sidra.